John Irwin, as always, it's great to have you here on Daily Drive.
Great to be here.
So, thought it would be a good time. I know we've talked about the Supreme Court ruling already and sort of the initial kind of reactions and meaning for the industry, but today wanted to have a maybe even more forward looking kind of discussion about what happens from now on, especially because it seems like some of this is temporary, but probably a good idea to level set anyway and just kind of start from the beginning. Of course, the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's reciprocal tariffs last week, but you report that auto industry duties largely remain in place. Walk us again through what changed with this ruling and what stayed in place.
Yeah, I think it's important to note more than anything else that this ruling from the Supreme Court doesn't impact auto tariffs or steel and aluminum tariffs. Those were implemented under a different law, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. That's not the law that was being interpreted by the Supreme Court in this case. What was affected was like you said, the reciprocal tariffs that Trump put in place back in April on trading partners of the U.S. They ended up ranging from 10 to 50%, and also the fentanyl tariffs that Trump put in place in response to fentanyl trafficking on goods from Canada, Mexico, and China. It's important to note that the auto industry, auto imports, whether it's vehicles, auto parts, and steel and aluminum, were exempted already from those reciprocal tariffs, and for the most part, at least, from those fentanyl tariffs, with the exception of parts and vehicles that come from China. Those are the only ones that are kind of stacked on top of the auto tariffs, even after all the other exemptions were put into place. So unless you were an importer of parts or vehicles from China, if you in that sense, a lot of things didn't necessarily change, for you. But at the same time, the auto industry has paid over the past year or so billions of dollars in those reciprocal tariffs and in those fentanyl tariffs. Like I said, some of that was vehicles and parts from China, but also beyond that, there's importers of industrial robotics and machinery for new factories, and also any parts that we have to remember. The auto parts tariff, there's a big list that the administration came out with back in April, went into effect in May of last year. A list that's since grown of parts that are subject to the auto tariff. But if the part that you're bringing in isn't on that list, it's possible that you've been paying the reciprocal tariff instead. So now that rate's gone, instead, the Trump administration, effective today, Tuesday, February 24th, has implemented, as of now, what is a 10% global tariff. Trump has said they're going to raise it to 15% in the coming days, but as of right now, it's 10%. That effectively replaces the reciprocal tariff that was in place. Instead of it ranging from 10 to 50%, it's a flat 15% global tariff that was implemented under, again, a different law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which basically allows the president to put into place a tariff of up to 15% in response to trade imbalances, essentially. It's important to note, though, that is only a temporary 150-day tariff. It goes away after that unless Congress votes to extend. So, yeah, there's a lot to pay attention to over the coming months as we see how the Trump administration tries to essentially recreate as best it can what it had implemented last year, but without the tools that the Supreme Court has since deemed were unconstitutional.
Yeah, and you describe in your story that the Section 122 tariff is sort of a bridge to something more permanent. What's the Trump administration planning, and what timeline are we looking at for those new duties? Do we have any information about that yet?
Yeah, the administration has signaled it's going to launch what are called Section 301 investigations, the same law that it's using to put into place this 150-day temporary tariff. Also allows the administration to launch investigations into unfair trade practices, and at the end of those investigations, potentially issue a tariff in response. The administration, Trump in his first term actually used Section 301 to implement certain tariffs on Chinese imports. So it looks like they're going to try to use Section 301 to, essentially try to recreate, at least to a degree, what it had with reciprocal tariffs. That said, these investigations take months, and we've yet to hear, as of taping at least, any of these investigations actually being started yet. And like I said, these things take months. It can even take more than a year historically. The Trump administration, if we're looking at other investigations that they've done over the, in the second term and even in the first term, they tend to try to move these things through as quickly as possible. But there are things, statutory requirements that, public hearings and chances for feedback from the public and from industry and things like that, that just require, a lot of time. And I think the idea is that they're hoping that at the end of this 150 days, they can have at least a lot of these tariffs, these new Section 301 tariffs in place. But what that looks like, how quickly, if they're able to get to that point within the next 5 months or so, kind of remains to be seen. I would expect, we've seen, ever since the, Liberation Day back in April, that auto tariffs, anything subject to an auto tariff, will remain exempt from anything new that's implemented. That's sort of been something that the industry pushed for immediately back at the beginning of Trump's term, and it's something that they've stuck with ever since. I would imagine that'll be the case, but that's something that, we'll just have to see. I'm sure the industry will continue to push for that. I know they were pushing for that when the Trump administration indicated they were going to go with this new temporary tariff, and they were able to secure that exemption here. But that's the thing. It's just going to take time. The Trump administration pursued reciprocal tariffs under this emergency powers law, in large part because they wanted to move quickly. They were able to, within just days of Trump announcing a tariff, implemented a tariff. Turns out that emergency powers law, there's nothing in that law that, explicitly says anything about tariffs. It's historically been used for sanctions and embargoes and that sort of thing. So all the other tools at Trump's disposal are either, temporary in nature or require a lot more time. They kind of view this temporary tariff as essentially buying them a little bit of time to sort of pick up the pieces.
And what's interesting to me is that with everything going on for the past year or so, the strategy has been to slap down tariffs and then negotiate, right? Like that's been Trump's playbook, basically. Yeah. And in the meantime, we've struck deals with the EU, Japan, South Korea, and the UK, all to lower auto tariffs in exchange for investments. How does this all affect those deals? What's going on with those?
Yeah, a lot of those are sort of, I think it's fair to say that, there's a little bit of uncertainty about what those deals end up looking like. Do they end up going into force long term? Just because, like you said, the carrot is sort of a carrot and stick thing, and where the administration was saying, hey, we have these reciprocal tariffs in place and auto tariffs. We'll lower both in exchange for investments and other concessions on trade. So the administration did lower, in most cases, except for the UK, the auto tariff down to 15%, as well as the reciprocal tariffs down to that level. But now that there are no reciprocal tariffs and there's just this temporary global tariff, it's sort of up in the air. Are these deals still going to remain in effect? How are they altered? What happens to them moving forward? I know the European Union officials there sort of indicated that they're hitting the pause button while they on implementing the deal that they struck with the U.S. Just while they figure out what's happening here. Now, to be clear, the auto tariff is still at 15% for anything coming in from the EU. That hasn't changed. That's something the Trump administration put into effect last year. But, if the EU hypothetically decides, we want to renegotiate the terms of this deal, just given the Supreme Court's decision, does that end up changing? Does the auto tariff end up being something that the Trump administration, again, sort of, the prospect of raising the auto tariff, is that something that the Trump administration might use to try to gain concessions? That still remains to be seen. It's sort of just something that's, been thrown out there. I think we'll find out more in the coming weeks and months even, but I've seen some analysts, basically said it's probably smart to think of those deals as sort of being more or less on hold at the moment, while everyone tries to figure out what exactly is going on. But yeah, I think that's a big deal because the other than Canada and Mexico, the U.S. has struck deals with every other major importer of vehicles into the U.S. to bring those rates, the auto tariff rate, down from 25% to 15%. And while that's still significantly higher than what the industry was dealing with before last year, a lot of people, kind of viewed that as a win. That okay, 15% is a number. Yeah, it's very costly, but it's more manageable in the long run than 25% would have been. And we'll have to see if this ends up impacting them at all. But yeah, it's certainly something that I know negotiators on both sides of these deals are looking at right now.
And you mentioned that Canada and Mexico are the two that we haven't reached a deal with, but we do have the USMCA review coming up, and you mentioned in your story that this ruling from the Supreme Court sort of removes a major threat point for the administration when it comes to those negotiations. So, what are you going to be watching for in terms of how this affects the USMCA situation?
Yeah, analysts at TD Cowen brought this up. That I thought was a really interesting point. That as I mentioned up top, the Trump administration early last year put in place these fentanyl tariffs on goods from Canada, Mexico, and China. Now, like with the auto tariffs, there are exemptions for goods that cross the border that comply with the USMCA's rules. But that was something that it appeared the Trump administration was going to sort of, again, kind of dangle in front of Canadian and Mexican negotiators, say, hey, we have this tariff in place here. We can get rid of it, but we're looking for certain concessions. But now the Supreme Court obviously has taken that tool away from the Trump administration. So it sort of resets the dynamics of those upcoming negotiations, at least to a degree. But yeah, that's going to be the big thing moving forward. Now that the Supreme Court decision has been rendered, and we're going to see kind of attention shift to a large degree to the USMCA and its future. As we talked about before, Trump has in the past sort of floated the potential for a U.S. withdrawal from the agreement, which is something that automakers and suppliers, very much in a united front have said, we don't want that. We see that the need for a trilateral agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico is vital to maintaining the industry's competitiveness globally in North America. But whether Trump's serious about that is something that's should be taken seriously, or whether it's a negotiating ploy, time will tell, obviously. But it's certainly true that tensions have been pretty high, especially between the U.S. and Canada in recent months. So we'll have to see how those play out. Obviously by July, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are supposed to lay out whether they want to proceed with the USMCA or make changes to it. But it's possible that that process could get extended well beyond July if they decide that we need to work through more things. It's possible that at that case things could extend beyond that deadline. So I know that's a possibility that some in the industry are preparing for. And I just know that a lot in the auto industry, given the scale of the investments that we're talking about, especially as we're trying to mitigate tariffs, the auto industry really wants to have some sort of long-term certainty on what are the rules in North America that we're going to be operating under as we make investments in the U.S. or elsewhere in North America. It can take years to get a return on investment in these gigantic projects, and it might be over the course of the next 10 years, to finally get that return that you're looking for. So we need those rules now, and they'll want those rules in place as soon as possible. But it looks like it might be kind of a dragged out, somewhat contentious process, and we'll see what happens.
John Irwin is our in-house expert reporter for Automotive News, covering tariffs and trade, and also GM for us here at Automotive News. John, thank you so much for joining us again, and thanks for all of your coverage on this. I hope people will go to autonews.com and see your great writing on this subject.
Thanks so much.